We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Elizabeth Bille. She is the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture at EVERFI. Elizabeth, could you share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and the work you do? And also would love to ask you the question of when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
I'd be happy to, Christina. Thank you so much for having me today. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Elizabeth Bille, and my pronouns are she and her. And I am the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture, as Christina noted. And in that role, I have the incredible opportunity of working with a number of companies from small organizations to some of the largest corporations in the world and helping them transform their workplace cultures through digital education. So we are an online training company, and I help to make sure that the training that we are delivering is not only compliant with any legal mandates that are out there, but also really teach employees and leaders the skills to be champions of workplace culture and to make their organizations a great place to work. So you asked me the question, yes, about what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Yeah.
I think it depends when in my life you asked me the question, because I was interested in a lot of different things. When I was very young, I actually wanted to be an archaeologist. I thought the idea of uncovering artifacts of ancient civilizations was really interesting to me. A little bit later, I wanted to be an actor. And in fact, I did a lot of acting and theater, really from when I was a young child all the way through college. But ultimately, the one that stuck was becoming an attorney. At that, I wanted to go to law school and really understand sort of the laws of the world that we live in. And that's a part of who I am today. I'm also a mom, which is something I always wanted to do as well. So I'm very fortunate to have that identity too.
Incredible. I don't think I've had archaeologist as an answer to the question before. So I love that. Also very creative. And you had a lot of experiences as well in terms of your career. I was reading through your bio, and I also love to ask people when they're on the show, about like where they came from and how do you think your personal journey really led you up until this point at EVERFI?
Yeah, I think a lot of my experiences, although I couldn't have known them at the time, definitely led me to where I am today. So back when I started working, I was always really interested in workplace issues. All of us are employees, right? At some point, and all of us are experiencing workplaces of some kind if we're working in a particular role. And so it was fascinating to me to sort of understand the relationships that we have at work and also the rules governing those relationships. And so that's what led me to become an employment attorney. And when I was an employment attorney, I found very quickly that what really was calling to me was the counseling aspect of it. So helping companies in advance to identify those policies, those procedures that help prevent problems from arising in the first place, rather than the litigation side of legal practice, which is really about focusing on dealing with a problem after the fact. Because of that, that has really gotten me interested in sort of prevention approaches or approaches for being proactive in workplaces. Then I had the opportunity to be in the in-house counsel's office at SHRM, and I was the general counsel of the Society for Human Resource Management for a time. And what I loved about SHRM, not only is it a fantastic organization, but we had the opportunity to reach so many HR professionals and so many organizations at scale, hundreds of thousands, to really, again, promote positive workplace practices. And then, of course, the Me Too movement happened in 2018. And for me, that's when I learned about EVERFI. I heard about this organization, this company who was doing some incredibly exciting work on really using digital training as a scalable way to reach incredible numbers of employees and really getting to the root causes of some of the most difficult, both social issues as well as workplace issues. So, I heard that they were planning on rebuilding some of their courses related to sexual harassment prevention, and the like. And they were going to try and do something that really hadn't been successfully done before, which is trying to prevent harassment from occurring before it starts. and not just simply teaching employees to spot when it has already happened. And so that mixed together all of the things that I was passionate about reaching organizations at scale, about preventing problems before they truly manifested. And I knew I wanted to be a part of it. So that was back in 2018, and I'm really delighted to be here.
And now we're here. I love that. We definitely share similar values and beliefs around just being proactive. And we're seeing so many companies do so as well, and creating a space where people feel included, and also that psychological safety piece as well. We know that it's table stakes too. And one of the things that you mentioned was kind of the rules that regulate the workplace too. And we're seeing so many changes all the time. And I wanted to ask you specifically too, how do you monitor and keep up to date with all of the workplace laws and trends, especially for different industries? And how do you think through that?
It's an incredible challenge, isn't it? I mean, when I think about the number of laws that are being passed every year that touch the workplace, and they're happening at so many levels. So it's not just federal laws or international laws, for example, but U.S. state laws. The state legislatures are incredibly active in legislating and in this area, often because I think they can do so faster and they can respond to needs and changes faster than the federal government can. But that creates a challenge for organizations to keep up with the changing legal landscape in the states in which they operate. Even cities, we've seen a number of cities and counties and other local governments who have been taking up the mantle and working to address issues that are important to them in the workplace. So keeping on top of it is tough. Thankfully, I do have several colleagues who are charged with monitoring legislative developments through legislative tracking services and regulatory tracking services to make sure that we're really keeping ahead of the changes in the laws. It's important because our courses do talk about the laws, and we want to make sure that we are anticipating changes before they become law, so that we can make sure that our courses are up to date real time with those developments. I also love to keep abreast of non-legal trends as well.
Right.
So what are the best practices that organizations are using, and what are the ways that organizations are looking at things? So one that I'm following with interest right now is that compliance professionals, for example, are increasingly becoming interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. This isn't just something that's happening within the DEI profession or even HR, but now compliance and legal are really seeing the relevance of that work to their own body of work. So I keep up with those as well, both by reading a lot of industry publications, as well as by talking one-on-one with professionals and at industry conferences, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that we're seeing in terms of trends as well. We just had a webinar around how compliance and legal teams really contribute to company culture as well, because if you're not on those teams, especially as an employee, you might wonder how they function and collaborate and work. And diversity, equity, and inclusion was a huge topic there as well. We've seen a lot of changes over this past year, but I want to also ask specifically around digital education. In your experience, have you seen effective digital education programs rolled out? If you could provide, an example or two.
Sure. Digital education, when I think about how it has evolved over the past several years, the change is really remarkable. I think back to early in my practice as either an attorney or in the HR space. When you think about digital education, you think about employees watching a video that's already been recorded, or employees clicking through equivalent of a set of slides with text on them and then answering some quiz questions. We have come so far in terms of digital education and how it can really be used not only to create an engaging experience, but also to really build skills in employees that they can then apply in their day-to-day working environment. So some of the things that I've seen work particularly well is, again, moving away from sort of a passive learning experience where people are just watching videos or reading text, but having to interact with the material, whether through written scenarios, for example, where they have to choose what to do next, or even better, and this is honestly something that I'm really most proud of, one of the most things I'm most proud of from our harassment and discrimination prevention course that we have branching video scenarios where the learner is actually sitting there watching a workplace situation unfold. And then at various points as it plays out, they have to choose what to do next. And then they see the impact of that action choice on the people in the room. Exactly. If they don't like how it turned out, they can back up and try something else. And this enables them to really practice different language to use, different ways of interacting with people that feels very realistic. The other thing I just would love to say is that, sometimes I hear people say, well, doesn't training need to be in person to really be effective? And I'd respectfully disagree with that. I think there's actually a number of advantages to digital training, uh, aside from just the scalability of it. If you have a 10,000 person workforce that's spread out across locations and time zones, it can be extremely difficult to pull everyone together in a physical location, COVID aside, and other safety concerns aside from that. But also, when we're dealing with sensitive topics like diversity, inclusion, and belonging, or bias training, or even harassment and discrimination, when we want employees to practice those skills, because again, that's how they really learn what to do, it can be really intimidating to practice in front of other people. And being able to do that in the privacy, if you will, of a one-on-one learning experience on the computer, it can actually be a much safer feeling experience for many employees.
I think that's a good point too, in terms of digital education too, for upskilling, and also to have that personalized experience to interact with what you're learning about, and have the opportunity to integrate it into kind of your thinking as well and build in that process. It's part of the company culture too. And one of the things that I know that we wanted to discuss too was around this culture of following up, how you really foster that. What does it really mean? So my next question for you is, how do you really define quote unquote follow-up culture?
Sure. I think there's several ways you could define it, but when I think about follow-up culture, I think about making sure that in the context of training, for example, that it's not just a one and done event, that it's something that is rolled out. Everyone makes sure that they complete by a particular deadline, and then everyone moves on to their day-to-day activities. But rather that it's the start of a conversation that's going to continue on through various different channels, and also a part of a more holistic strategy in terms of transforming company culture. So, for example, if you implement a particular training, use that opportunity to gather data from your employees about their sentiments about that topic. For example, also gauge how willing they are to speak up if they see behavior that runs counter to company culture, or gauge their comfort level with the topic and with being a champion of, for example, diversity in the workplace, or inclusion, or belonging. Then what you can do is you can take that data and then you can use it to inform your next set of initiatives. This is a form of following up. And then craft a set of communication strategies, additional training that may be needed, roundtable discussions to delve deeper into some areas where people had questions, or didn't feel like their organization had invested enough. And then formulate those initiatives based on the data that you gathered from the training and things like that. Then once you roll those out, or actually what I would say is you should actually set some goals around what you would do next. Then implement the initiatives that are data informed once again, and then test again, measure again, see how you're performing, and communicate out, what's been done, get people's feedback on how they thought it went, and then iterate and start the process again. So it's sort of a living cycle, using data, using goal setting, measurement, input from your employees, feeding that back to employees so that they know what you've done and that you take these issues seriously, and then continuing to iterate from there.
Yeah, I like the example of having it be cyclical instead of a linear process, especially with training and within the context of the employee kind of experience too, and not being afraid to try something, iterate on it, get employee feedback, and then continue to have the conversation. Definitely not a check the box mentality as well. And something else that is really important to company culture is just the experience of individuals too. We know that everybody is is different as well. And I wanted to ask from your kind of perspective, what is really important to ensure all employees at an organization feel like they are really part of the company?
Yes, well, I think you mean in terms of feeling included and feeling a sense of
Yeah,
belonging.
feeling a sense of belonging.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, there's so much that needs to be done. I think the first step is just realizing that this is an intentional activity. To create a sense of inclusion, to create a feeling of belonging is not something that just happens, and it certainly is not something that can be done on autopilot. There needs to be a strategy around it with buy-in from institutional leaders as well, in order to make it happen. And really, um, it it there, it involves, recognizing people for who they are and their unique identities and experiences and perspectives in the workplace, and really letting people know that they are valued. It means creating an environment where people feel like they can express who they are and do so without retribution, and not just without retribution, but also that is welcomed and encouraged.
Mhm.
And really, like you mentioned this earlier about creating a sense of psychological safety. It's about creating an environment where you proactively say, "We want to hear from you.
Mhm.
We want to hear uh, what do you think about things. We want to hear your ideas, and we also want to hear from you when the news is not good, because that's really how we create the best possible working environment. Is when we hear what we could be doing better." So again, it's about soliciting input to employees, and to your previous point, it's about sharing back with them what you're doing in response, and what initiatives you're implementing in response to what you're hearing from them, bad or good, to create that kind of inclusive culture. It involves, praising people when they speak up, and
Mhm.
rewarding people who are seeking to contribute to that positive culture. Um, and then, like I said, really leading by example,
Mhm.
getting the buy-in of leaders, and making sure that leaders are making it's a priority for them, to be fostering this kind of work environment as well.
Yeah, inclusivity includes celebrating the wins, having hard conversations, and really that follow-up culture that you were talking about too. Nobody likes to, put themselves out there, be vulnerable, give that feedback, and then feel like it goes into a black box. Nobody ever talks about it again. They're more likely not to give feedback in the future if that is the case as well. And having that feeling of, you belong at an organization, you feel like your voice is heard, it can sometimes be an intangible feeling or sense. But when you have these strategic goals, you're inputting all of these initiatives, you do want to measure its success. And you touched on this a little bit in terms of kind of the feedback you receive and how you kind of change your strategy here. But what are effective ways to measure a sense of belonging at a workplace?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways that you could do this, but it definitely involves measurement again. As you can tell, I'm a big proponent of data, um, and in part because I think, um, a lot of companies rely on data for so many things, right? We wouldn't think of launching a new product line without doing a heck of a lot of market research first, right? And then measuring the success of that market launch, of that product launch. We wouldn't think of launching an advertising campaign without having a good idea of what we needed to do in advance, and then measuring its success afterwards. In the HR space, we've been a little bit hesitant sometimes to think about the power of data, or maybe not fully realize the potential of data to inform our initiatives related to workplace culture. But it's such a powerful tool to make sure that we're addressing the right issues in the right way, and then continuing to improve on those as we go along. So to your answer to your question specifically, a couple of different ways you could measure belonging. One would be by asking employees directly about it, and you could do that through an employee attitude survey, or as I mentioned before, sometimes workplace training courses have the opportunity to attach surveys to them to ask them questions related to how they perceive their workplace fares on various measures of belonging, inclusion, and the like. So asking employees whether they feel like they can express their identities openly at work, asking whether they feel like they can they can share aspects of themselves at work, for example? And do they feel like their colleagues support them and help them feel included? So you can ask them directly in those ways. Another way you can measure sort of the success of your belonging work, for example, especially if you've been working at this for a bit, is to measure behaviors that are correlated with belonging or correlated with inclusion. So you can, or you can ask people to say, do you feel like you understand your role in creating a culture of belonging? Do you feel like you are able to speak up if you see someone who's not uh, uh, acting in accordance with our values or who is not acting inclusively? Do you feel like you can work effectively with people across differences, for example? And if not, what can we do to help? So by both asking people, do they feel like they themselves belong, but also measuring employees' confidence and sense of ability of their role in creating a culture of belonging, you can get both perspectives and therefore continue your work on improving that sense of belonging going forward.
Absolutely. There are qualitative and quantitative ways to really measure your success here. And it's, again, it's not, a destination, it's always a journey. So making
Absolutely.
sure that you're implementing things all the time. Again, people are really dynamic. So you need to understand and meet folks where they are. And a lot of what we're talking about too, in terms of asking employees how they feel, employee feedback is around employee trust and listening. You need to have those as a foundation and impart these listening strategies. And I don't think it could be overstated how important that is. But some people might think that in the past, this is a nice to have, but it's really become a need to have too, especially in a remote first world hybrid approach and just the future of work that we're seeing in general. So I wanted to ask you, how do you really see a culture of employee listening and trust really manifesting in an organization?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, Christina. This is so important. And it's not just important to creating a culture of listening and trust. It's not just important for creating a workplace, positive working environment in terms of, as we think about that in sort of the employee relations sense or HR
Sure.
sense, but also just for good business, for business success.
Yeah.
If, if employees don't feel like they can raise their hand in a meeting and say, I have a concern with the design of this product. I don't think that's actually going to land as well as we hope it will. How disastrous would that be if that person didn't feel like they could speak up? I mean, you could inadvertently launch something that doesn't succeed at all, and that could cost the organization a lot of time and money. It's the same concept for workplace culture as well. If we don't ask employees how they're doing, what do they think, if we do not invite them to speak up and then truly listen when they do speak up, we are really hurting ourselves in terms of creating the kind of innovative, collaborative, thriving working environment that not only can have business success, but can also protect us from harm
Mhm.
and business harm, as well as, as we talked about, exclusion, bias events, harassment, and discrimination. Employees really, really are on the front lines of seeing so much. And if we don't empower them to share what they know, then problems will just continue to manifest and they will escalate. So I think this really represents a shift sometimes in thinking. Sometimes employers are reticent to ask employees to really be candid about what they're experiencing because there's either a fear that, ooh, we'll have to do something about it if we hear about it, or we might find out some bad news. I would invite employers to rethink that and say, what a great opportunity for us to get ahead of things and to fix them before it becomes a PR crisis, for example, or the like. So really having that conversation and genuinely telling employees we want to know is critical. Of course, the flip side of that is make sure we don't retaliate or otherwise dissuade people from
Right.
speaking up or retaliating against them if they do. And then the final piece is I think we owe it to employees that if they do speak up, we owe it to them to tell them what we did with that information. So there is a bit of accountability there, but that's how you build trust. If there's a incredible saying, and that HR people unfortunately sometimes hear incredible is it's not the right word. An unfortunate saying, which is, I complained to HR and nothing happened. A lot
Yeah.
of our professionals have heard that. And, sometimes that may be the case that nothing happened, but most of the time things are happening, but there's just not a good feedback loop
Oh, yeah.
to the people providing the feedback about what we did. And so I would also say that in order to truly create that culture of trust, that we need to do a bit better job, organizations need to do a bit better job of sharing back what we did, what changes we implemented, and even how we held people accountable, if it's appropriate to do so, in order to demonstrate that we mean what we say when we say we want to hear from you, and we will take action in an appropriate way when we do.
Accountability, ownership is really important in having that two-way communication, and that's how trust is built as well. It's a conversation between two people too. And I want to go back to your earlier point as well in terms of people or companies being afraid of perhaps negative feedback or hearing something they don't want to hear. Just because you don't hear it now does not mean there is, your company culture is perfect, there's no issues, and it's really important to flex that muscle so when things come up they really trust the organization and know where to go as well. I do have another question around really effective training. We talked about effective employee training, but I know that you have experience in training EEO investigators, employees, HR professionals, employment law attorneys on complex workplace issues. These are not black and white issues, they're very gray. These are hard conversations to have. How do you really think about creating impactful training that goes beyond the hour or the day, even days sometimes you have with these different stakeholders?
I think there's several strategies that we need to employ to make sure that training really sticks and is really engaging. So the first thing is that you want to make sure that the topics that you're covering and the way that you're covering them feel really realistic to the learner, and that it's something that they plausibly could come across in their day-to-day work. So there's nothing worse than training that is either doesn't feel realistic or is so obvious of a situation that you think, gosh, that would never happen, or of course that I wouldn't do something like that. I'm
Right.
almost insulted that you brought that up. I would never engage in that kind of behavior in the workplace. And the problem is when training is misses the mark like that and does not feel relevant, and in fact almost feels insulting because it's not
Yes,
nuanced,
yeah.
not, yeah, it can actually turn learners off and can sometimes even lead to the opposite effect. So there's a researcher named Dr. Shannon Rowski who's done some really interesting research on sexual harassment training specifically, and she was trying to uncover why is it that so many people hate taking their annual sexual harassment training. And what she found is that for 25% of learners, they have what's called a backlash response. And
Mhm.
that is they reject the training because they, for a variety of reasons, sometimes because the training is presented in a very negative way, like a threat, like don't do this or else these will be your penalties. That can be a real turnoff to people. And it can make them say, well, I would never do something like that. And that can cause them to reject the training. Other times things don't feel very realistic at all. Like, that would never happen here. This doesn't feel applicable to me and my role. And so the problem is that when employees have those kind of backlash responses or reject the training out of hand like that, it can actually cause harm in the workplace. What she found is that can actually make employees more likely to engage in certain type of sex-based behaviors at work, like increased flirting or telling sexual jokes, and decreased likelihood to report problems when they arise. So what we've done is basically caused more problems as opposed to preventing them simply because of the tone of the training and the examples are used. So it's not just a nice to have relevant scenarios and to present the information in a way that feels relevant, but you've really got to do it. Otherwise, it can cause a host of problems. The other thing I would say is that in addition to the framing of the training and that experience, we also need to continue the impact of that training by supporting it with subsequent initiatives. Companies or organizations can follow up with additional messaging, for example, just to keep the topics top of mind, on a periodic basis. It can facilitate conversations about the training or the topics that were covered in team meetings, for example. You can use the data that you got from some of the questions you may have asked in the training to do some focused outreach to certain employee populations who may have responded differently to some of those questions about belonging or how safe they feel at work. You can engage um, your employee groups that you might have, for example, your affinity groups, to help you dig deeper into some of these areas to make sure that people who may be having unique experiences are also heard um, as a result of the training.
I think tone is really important, especially when it comes to training and the mindset people have going into it. Again, whether it's interactive, if there's a digital kind of option for that as well, as we were talking about too, in terms of people feeling psychologically safe to interact with the content too. And we've talked a lot about just like common mistakes, even with the best of intentions, whether you're not following up or you're not, going beyond that hour, just the training time itself. Are there any other kind of common mistakes you've seen companies make in their mission to develop a really thriving company culture?
Hmm. Sure. I first organizations need to really understand that culture is not about perks. It's not about benefits even necessarily. All of the things that sort of come top of mind for us when we talk about culture, that we think about dress codes, snacks, or a lunchroom or something like that, really don't make company culture at all. In fact, you could have all the best perks in the world and have a really toxic working environment.
Yep.
So what we need to do is, number one, make sure that I think one of the common mistakes is not realizing that culture is really about your organization's values. It's really about how we interact with each other and how we treat each other, and about how we work together, really. Um, I think another common mistake is not realizing how intentional we have to be as we're building and supporting that culture. You can't let a culture go on autopilot, and it really requires nurturing and continued work. And so the ways that you support that are, again, very intentionally through communications, regular communications that evidence the kind of culture that you want to have, through making sure that your managers are absolutely supporting and all aligned in terms of their support of that company culture. And so training your managers and equipping them with the tools to be ambassadors of your culture, not just in big ways, but in those everyday ways as well. It's those individual moments that are actually where culture most comes through, about how you and I talk to each other on a daily basis, or when things get hard. That's where culture really shines, and that's where companies should really be focusing their efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. It's not about, we always talk about now that we are kind of more in a virtual world. It's not about the happy hours or the ping pong tables or there's like a game room or a nap room in the company. It comes down to the company's values and how they're modeled throughout people, leaders, leadership, people who have been at the company for a while, and how you are demonstrating those and leading through example. I guess on the flip side of common mistakes, I want to talk about must-haves for the future of work. What do you think companies must have in order to be successful in the future? I know you've talked about a couple different things, but really want to emphasize that too, as best practices for folks who are listening.
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you. Um, there's many, but I think the three that really come to mind, or maybe I'll boil them down to two, is one is, you know, employees are really looking to their employers to ramp up their efforts related to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. We heard that loud and clear in 2020, and we're continuing to hear it in 2021. And what they're looking for is action that goes beyond the initial round of statements that may have happened, statements of support for these issues, but really about making an investment in supporting diversity, inclusion, and belonging at all levels of the organization, and through all of the processes and policies that the organization has as well. So this is deep work. This isn't something that can be box that can be checked overnight. It really involves taking a look at everything in the employee life cycle from recruiting all the way until retirement, if you will, to make sure that the experiences are inclusive, that opportunities are equitable, that we're putting a lens or an intentionality on ensuring diverse voices and perspectives and identities are brought to the table, that voices are amplified, and that those contributions are acknowledged and rewarded. Making that a part of the DNA of the organization is something that's a must-have for going forward. Not only to make sure that you keep and can attract the workforce that you need today and tomorrow, but also for business success. Along with that, I think is the employers. We've heard a lot of them focusing on this issue, and I think it's going to be a must-have going forward, and that's supporting employee well-being.
Mhm.
The events of 2020 and 2021, from COVID-19 to the incidents of racial injustice and bias and hate crimes in our communities, to financial distress that resulted from COVID-19 and other things, has really brought to light an issue of employee well-being as being not just a benefits issue or a nice to have, but truly a workforce sustainability issue. That we have in many organizations across the country, employees who are under extreme stress, who are on the verge of burnout, who are trying to navigate so much, and employers are realizing that they need to do more to support them. So take, again, not just providing benefits, but thinking more holistically about the employee experience to make sure that we're helping employees manage stress, that we're helping them find time for their own self-care, and to safeguard against burnout. I think those are probably the two issues I would say are must-haves going forward to make sure that everyone can be successful.
Holistic well-being is really important, especially for team members and working in different locations. You never know what somebody has going on in addition to their work as well. We talk about burnout a lot. It's definitely a hot topic in terms of how people can proactively prevent that on their teams too. My next question is looking ahead, and I'm going to keep it vague on purpose, but what are you looking forward to?
Oh, I am really looking forward to seeing how the workplace continues to evolve this year and in the years after, particularly through the lens of hybrid and remote working environments. I,
Absolutely.
yeah, what we've seen from all the data is that a number of organizations and their leaders are planning on adopting hybrid work environments going forward. So some of their workforce in person in some locations, some at a remote location, maybe mixing it up from time to time, maybe permanently a permanent remote contingent. There's a whole host of ways that this could work. I'm excited to see how organizations navigate this. It's going to require, again, a lot of thought, a lot of planning, and a lot of iteration, because surely no one's going to get it right the first time, and we'll all need to make sure that we continue to learn from what works and what doesn't, and retool from there. But I think it's an incredible opportunity to not only provide employees with more flexibility um, in where they work if possible, but also, we've heard so many things that hybrid work or remote work works really well for a lot of organizations or a lot of employees, excuse me, whether in terms of helping them navigate their work and personal life, from helping avoid microaggressions that may be happening in the workplace, to helping with disability or health related accommodations. It really can be a win-win. And so I'm excited to see how employers continue to be creative as they were during COVID-19, implement the lessons that they learned and the successes that they achieved during COVID and the remote work experiment, and make those sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see a lot of corporate cultures were very against working from home or remote work. And then when you're forced to do it and employees can prove that they can kind of be trusted and have this flexibility and also maybe be more productive at home as well, there's a
Mhm.
whole future of work that's flipped on its head too. So I'm also excited to see what the future has in store. I know we talked about a variety of different topics this afternoon, but is there anything I didn't ask that you want to share with our audience before we close out our conversation, or one to two key takeaways you hope that people bring with them?
Oh, we had such a wonderful conversation. We touched on so much. I think that the themes are simply that uh, planning and being intentional in driving the workplace culture that you want to have is critical, and
Mhm.
that people need to receive skill building in how to do that. So, so much of these things that we've been talking about today, whether it's wellness or whether it's diversity, inclusion, and belonging, or harassment prevention, these are real skills that need to be built. That this is not something that we're all born with to know how to do these things effectively. They are muscles that we need to tone, as you mentioned earlier, and employers really by investing in that skill building for their workforces, they will not only be able to prevent risks from happening and prevent problems from occurring, but they can create that proactively positive workplace culture along the way.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Don't be on autopilot, be super intentional and ask for feedback, of course. Thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm excited to continue to stay in touch.
Thank you so much. I love the conversation.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, All Voices believes in the empowerment of everyone at an organization to speak up, and we know it's a requirement for the company to succeed. We'll speak soon.